March 7th, first Friday of the month, reflection by Reverend Father Clifford Atta Anim. Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 to 15, memorial of Saints Perpetua and Felicity. Fasting and feasting, Jesus' response to John's disciples. Today's gospel presents a question posed by some disciples of John the Baptist regarding the contrast between their fasting practices and the apparent feasting of Jesus' disciples. In Jewish religious tradition, prayer, fasting, and almsgiving were considered the three pillars of spiritual life. Therefore, John's disciples were curious why they and the Pharisees observed fasting, while Jesus and his followers seemed to focus on feasting. Jesus' response through three metaphors. The bridegroom and the wedding guests. Matthew chapter 9, verses 14 to 15, Mark chapter 2, verses 18 to 20, Luke chapter 5, verses 33 to 35. Jesus compares himself to a bridegroom and his disciples to the friends of the groom who celebrate with joy during the wedding feast. In Jewish culture, a wedding was a time of great rejoicing, and guests were not expected to fast during the celebration. Jesus implies that as long as he, the bridegroom, is present with them, his disciples will rejoice. But a time will come when he is taken away, a reference to his passion and death, and then they will fast. Spiritual meaning. The Church Fathers see this imagery as a symbol of Christ, the bridegroom, and his church, the bride. Our fasting is not about mere ritualistic practice, but a longing for deeper union with Christ. The patch on an old garment, Matthew chapter 9, verse 16. Jesus says that a new unshrunken cloth cannot be used to patch an old garment because the new patch will shrink and make the tear worse. The spiritual meaning here is that this metaphor illustrates Jesus' message brings something entirely new, not just a patch on old religious customs. The new covenant of grace cannot simply be added to the old ways of legalism. New wine in old wineskins, Matthew chapter 9, verse 17. In ancient times, wine was stored in animal skin containers. New wine, as it fermented, expanded, requiring flexible wineskins. If poured into old, rigid wineskins, they would burst. The spiritual meaning here is that the message of Jesus is like new wine, which requires a new heart, renewed by the Holy Spirit, as mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26. Our faith should be open, adaptable, and receptive to God's ongoing work rather than rigid and resistant to change. The role of fasting in Christian life. Jesus' response does not reject fasting, but places it in its proper context. His disciples did fast at the appointed times prescribed by the law, but they were not bound by the additional fasts imposed by the Pharisees. Later, the apostles and the early church practiced fasting, not as a burden, but as a spiritual discipline.